Thank you very much, and thank you, Christian, for inviting me. I'm very glad to be part of this series and to have enjoyed looking around the exhibition, which I think is a model of how to do history, actually, and how to exhibit history to the people. It was a pleasure to visit it. Late in his life, the famous 14th century chronicler and Hainaulter Jean Froissart paid a second visit to England, a country where he had spent about a decade in his youth. Age had somewhat soured his opinions, but it had not eroded their sharpness. The English, he wrote, are a people of a haughty disposition, hot-tempered and quick to anger, slow to be brought to gentleness and difficult to pacify. They take comfort in haste in battle and in slaughter. Covetous of the possessions of others, they are incapable by nature of joining in friendship or alliance with another nation. They are underhand and proud. Continuing his theme, Froissart went on to explain how it was that the English allowed themselves to offend the canons of chivalrous respectability so grievously. The answer lay in the structures of political society. There is in England too great a difference in nature and condition between the nobles on the one hand and the mixed or middling people, the hommes mesquis and the villeins on the other. For the gentlemen are noble and loyal of temperament, and the common people are cruel, perfidious, proud and disloyal. And when the people wish to show their villainy and power, the nobles offer no resistance. For quite a time now, they've got on well together, because the nobles have limited their demands to what is reasonable. But the people will not hand over their goods to anyone without payment, even an egg or a chicken. The guildsman and the labourer live in England by the work of their hands, and the gentlemen live from their rents and revenues. But if the king requires their services, they must be paid. For the king cannot simply tillage his people. No, the people could not suffer it. There are certain ordinances and agreements made instead on the staple of walls, and from these the king is funded above his own rents and revenues. And when they make war, that tax is doubled. It is lucky that England is the best protected country in the world, because otherwise the English could not survive. Any king who is their lord must govern himself as the people wish, and incline himself very much to their wills. And if he does the contrary, and bad results follow, he will come to grief, as did King Edward II. So on one level, this seems a very familiar, even a timeless portrait of the English. We readily recognise that oi for England, Brits abroad yobbishness, the disdain for other cultures, the quickness to anger, and so on, even if Froissart doesn't mention the heavy drinking that was and is such a feature of foreign representations of our countrymen. And equally, I think we can see here the outlines of the English constitutional tradition, according to which, as the 15th century political theorist Sir John Fortescue was to put it 70 years later, the king may not impose tallages, subsidies or any other burdens whatever on his subjects, nor change their laws, nor make new ones, without the concession or assent of his whole realm, expressed in his parliament. So in Froissart's short account then, the world of Magna Carta, Parliament and the deposition of kings is married to the persona of John Bull and a culture of uppity plebs, of bully beef commoners who've somehow managed to subjugate the government and the ruling classes to the common will. But let's pause there for a moment. This is the Middle Ages we're talking about. Wasn't that an era of gross social inequality, of serfdom, oppression and misery, of divinely appointed kings and chivalrous warfare conducted by obscenely wealthy aristocrats? Isn't it rather surprising to hear a well-informed contemporary suggesting that in England the common people were effectively in charge and the crown was obliged to defer to their wishes? Well, we might allow a certain amount for Froissart's hyperbole, and we'd have to recognise that he was opening up an implicit comparison with snooty and absolutist France, the readers south of the Channel. But actually, I and a cluster of other historians working on this period are beginning to think that Froissart's impressions were not so very wide of the mark. that the common people did have a certain capacity to set the political agenda in later medieval England, and that a better understanding of the commons and their role in politics could alter our perspectives on the Middle Ages and open up some fruitful lines of inquiry about our polity as it is today. The time that Fortescue and Froissart were writing about and writing in was a time in which the notion of common and action by the commons were very prominent. Common profit, common weal, the common voice, the common world speech, that is, the newly prominent and semi-standardised English vernacular, these were the buzzwords of this age. And risings of the commons punctuated the period, on a small scale in 1327 at the deposition of Edward II, as a spectre in the crisis of 1340 when taxable resources were stretched to the very limit, and then dramatically realised in the Great Revolt of 1381, when the people rose up across the south and east of England, killing the royal treasurer and the Archbishop of Canterbury, distributing letters and presenting petitions to the young King Richard II at Smithfield on the edge of London. Similar risings broke out in Cheshire in 1393, in the southwest in 1400, in Yorkshire in 1405, at St Giles's Fields in London in 1414, and in Oxfordshire in 1431. And then on a huge scale in Kent and Essex in 1450, when Jack Cade and the Commons entered London and tried and executed a number of so-called traitors around King Henry VI. And then at various places and times in the Wars of the Roses, in Yorkshire in 1489, in the southwest in 1497, in East Anglia in 1525, and on a truly epic scale across Lincolnshire, Yorkshire and the northern counties in the Pilgrimage of Grace for the Commonwealth in 1536-7, and then again across Norfolk, the southeast and the West Country in 1549. And these were just the larger episodes. More localised demonstrations took place across England and across the period in English towns, many of them characterised as risings of the commons. Sam Cohn counts 231 such episodes between 1200 and 1450, and there were plenty more in the 50 years or so that followed. In all, this was an age of frequent popular political assertion, in which the commons were the leading actors. So in this lecture, I want to explore the causes, the meaning, and the implications of this state of affairs. As may already be clear, this will be partly an inquiry into ideas and terms. Commons was and is a term of art, adopted by people playing a role for particular purposes. It wasn't a simple term of social description, if social description is ever simple. But my inquiry is also concerned with social and political realities. Those claiming to be the commons were, of course, groups of real people. Which people? Seeking what? And what can this tell us? So this is about ideas and realities, and of course it can be misleading to distinguish between them. The notions and terms and languages that circulate in political society are realities, just as much as institutions, groups, and material interests. So I've organised my talk around three related questions, or groups of questions. First of all, what did this claim to be the commons mean? Second, who were the commons, and what enabled and what provoked them to act as they did? And thirdly, what kinds of action did the role of commons permit? And where did that action lead? By exploring these three questions, I hope to show that the status of commons enabled ordinary English subjects, sometimes including the very humblest, to take action as if they were citizens. That ancient political identity of commons thus exposes something very deep-seated, but also very present today in our paradoxical kingdom, where we are British citizens and European citizens, but still subjects of Her Majesty. So perhaps the place to start with the meaning of commons is its first uses by popular insurgents in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. According to the chronicler Thomas Walsingham, the villeins of St Albans gloried in the name of commons, and considered no name more honourable than the name of the communitas, i.e. the community, or perhaps the commonalty. By this name, he implied, they intended to consider no one as their lord, except the king alone and the commons. Now that action in St Albans fits very closely with the behaviour of other rebels in London, when Wat Tyler, displaying a banner of St George, as we've seen, called the king brother and told him that he and his colleagues had come to save the king and destroy the traitors around him. According to the anonymous chronicler, the rebels' watchword in London was, "With whom holdest you? With King Richard and the true commons." Now, apart from noting that popular rebels could use the word whom correctly in 1381, what should we make of these statements? First of all, we should note the chronicler's surprise. It clearly wasn't normal for villeins, labourers and small artisans to be considered commons. And most contemporary commentators tried to deny them this name, referring instead to rustics, villeins, labourers, peasants and so on. What the rebels were claiming by their choice of name was membership of a political community. Probably, in the St Albans case, the status of burgess or citizen, that is, free man of the community that was the basis of every chartered town. But also, and certainly in London, membership of the commune or community of the realm, that collectivity of the English people that was represented in Parliament, the heirs of the common law, the source of consent to legislation and taxation, the natural counsellors and defenders of the king against his enemies. This commune or community of the realm was first conceived in the early 13th century, modelled on a mixture of Roman and canon law and the established practices and terminologies of the towns of the realm. It meant two things. First of all, a political collectivity with more or less republican characteristics, that's to say, a measure of self-government, the possession of some common assets and collective responsibilities, some form of representation in which more important members of the community stood for the rest. So it meant political collectivity, and second, it often meant a group of non-nobles, comprehending the mass of the population. In most early usages, the commune or community meant a group of minor aristocrats or rich oligarchs who were standing for a nebulous wider group. That's what the framers of Magna Carta had in mind when they imagined the king being distrained by 25 barons and communa tocius terrae, the commune of the whole realm. It is also what Simon de Montfort and the baronial reformers meant in 1258 when they wanted 12 of their number elected pour tout le commune de la terre, for all the commune of the realm, of the land, But as Parliament developed and as representative activity became a more normal feature of national politics, so the name of the representatives merged with the body that they were representing. And those who representant totam communitatem, as the early 14th century modus tenendi parliamentum put it, the knights of the shire and the burgesses of the towns, came to be known more simply as le commune de la terre, the commune of the realm, la communauté du royaume, the community of the realm, or just as le commun, or la commune, and then, from the 1340s, les communes, with an S on the end. And as French began to give way to English in the last quarter of the 14th century, les communes became the commons. And in the wake of 1381, this was a group that included or implied the mass of the people, as well as their elite representatives. And if we look at some 15th century uses of the term commons, we can see that it retained this sense of political collectivity, even as it came to refer to ordinary subjects. A poem of 1400, for example, asked, "What doth the king's crown signify when stones and flowers on circle is bent?" And it answered, "Lords, commons and clergy, to be all at one assent." It warns the king to take good attent. If he wants to retain his crown, he must understand that the least liege man with body and rent, he is a parcel of the crown. The least subject is part of the crown of the realm. So the crown stood for the political community, and so did the commons. This idea was attested countless times and harmlessly in poetry. A kingdom in commons lies. Came there a king, knighthood him led, might of the commons made him to reign. For commons is the fairest flower that ever God set on earthly crown. But the same idea which appears in poetry was also mobilised politically, drastically so, when the murderers of Henry VI's chief minister, the Duke of Suffolk, in 1450, declared that the crown was the community or commons of the realm, and they were acting in its name by removing this traitor. And somewhat less controversially, when throughout the first half of the 15th century the principle of the common profit or the common weal was associated above all with the testimony of the commons. In the petitions of MPs, in the manifestos of dissenting magnates, and in the words of popular rebels themselves, presenting the petitions of us true and faithful subjects and commons of this land. Oh, I've got ahead of myself. The petitions of us true and faithful subjects and commons of this land for the great weal and surety of the King, our sovereign Lord, and his heirs, and the common weal of this land ever to be continued, as they put it in 1469. So action by the commons, then, was action in the name of the commons, and therefore in the name of the community of the realm, and by implication also in the name of the king and all loyal and right-thinking subjects of his. It was the assertion of a right to act publicly on behalf of the common weal, and it was powerfully associated with a range of other ideas hinted at in what I've said so far. Truth-telling, openness, correction, especially correction of hidden wrongs, to prove who is God's friend, wrote a 15th century poet. Commons be witness of their deeds. Unless the commons of England help the king, wrote another, Suffolk, the chief minister, will bear the crown. In their unerring sense of what was good and right, the commons were like God. And the common voice was like God's voice, vox populi, vox Dei, as the contemporary tag ran, calling for vengeance on liars and traitors, and those who took out of the common good for singular profit and put nothing back. Although the actions of the commons were often extra-legal, the commons were at pains to assert their respect for, indeed defence of, the law, the ancient law of Winchester against the newfangled ordinances made against the people in 1381, a just and a true inquiry by the law in 1450, and so on. The commons were a mirror of the faults of the realm, calling for reformation and a return to what was right and customary. So on then to my second cluster of questions. Who were the commons? What enabled them to act in this way? And what provoked them to act? These last two questions are not, of course, precisely the same. We need to understand what it was in the undeniably unequal society of later medieval England that enabled the commons to organise themselves for public action. Legitimations of the kind that we've heard about must be part of the answer, but they can't be all of it. And we also need to consider the circumstances under which commons action took place. Like divine vengeance, it was exceptional, even if awareness of the possibility of it could have a chastening and moderating effect at most times. We've seen that the commons were people playing a role, and it was important to the credibility of that role that participation in common ventures was broad. Studies of the rebels of 1381, for example, make it quite clear that they included ordinary labourers, villeins, and low-grade craftsmen, as well as the richer peasant tenants, who would later be known as husbandmen or yeomen. As far as we can tell, the same kind of mixture was involved in later rebellions. It's difficult to be sure because both indictment evidence and pardon evidence tends to focus on the better off, because these people had goods to distrain, or they could buy their way out of trouble, or they were simply more familiar to indicting juries than humbler types. But we do have evidence, again, of ordinary people taking action on later occasions. So a thresher, for example, waved his flail in front of the king on the road to Leicester in 1450. A simple poor man posed as Captain Poverty in Richmondshire in 1536. A clutch of peasant women were indicted along with male tenants of Lord Scroope in 1470. But generally, as far as we know, the leading figures in Commons revolts were the leading men of villages and parishes: churchwardens, reeves, constables and bailiffs, the leading tenants and taxpayers, the holders of office. They were often aided and enforced by local clergy, especially during the Reformation, by ex-soldiers, by members of the local militia, and sometimes by local lawyers, such as Robert Aske, the Earl of Northumberland's secretary, who wrote the manifestos of the Yorkshire rebels in the Pilgrimage of Grace. And this reference to Aske reminds us that revolts of the Commons were socially extensive in two directions, or at least most of them were. Apart from in 1381, when lordship was a dirty word, and in 1549, when the rebels in both Norfolk and the South West would have no state of a gentleman, as one of the Devon insurgents put it, dissenting Commons normally attempted to call lords and gentry to arms with them on behalf of the commonweal or commonwealth and against its enemies. And this social inclusiveness was part and parcel of the Commons' ideological positioning. But it also bears on the question of what it was that had enabled people of modest social standing to take public action. The idea that the realm was a political community was not entirely a fiction. For one thing, royal government penetrated very deeply into society, collecting taxes from a broad cross-section of peasant tenants, even in normal times, let alone in the extraordinary circumstances of the poll taxes of 1377 to 80, or the multiple levies of 1489, 1495 to 7 and 1522 to 5, all of which produced significant rebellions. The government regulated great swathes of social life by statute. It imposed obligations of defence. It extended access to royal law to almost everyone by the end of the 14th century. A host of representative media were created in order to support and assist this intrusive government. Besides Parliament, which represented social elites, there were bodies that included ordinary people, panels to determine the local burden of taxation, for example, tithings and views of frank pledge for the organisation of local peacekeeping and defence, juries of local men and women for prosecutions and inquiries on behalf of church and state, parish committees to sustain the fabric of the local church. These were the structures through which people were mobilised by village leaders. And the typical repertoires associated with these structures, the taking of oaths, the ringing of the common bell, the assembling in the churchyard, these normal repertoires of village mobilisation could be used for insurgent purposes as well as obedient ones. And of course, as we've seen, the boundaries between insurgency and obedience were blurred for the Commons, and perhaps unclear. They were required to take action for the king in defence of law, order and the realm. Did that not also entail a responsibility to defend custom, to defend what was reasonable, to attack novelties that had been imposed by evil counsellors and traitors in the king's household? After all, it was axiomatic in common wisdom that, in the words of a 15th century poem, the king knoweth not all. In the last resort, only the truth-telling, all-seeing Commons knew the rightness of things. And that last point draws attention to another strand in the empowerment of ordinary people as common representatives: the wide exposure of the ideology of the commune that I depicted earlier, which was reproduced in poetry and proclamations, proverbs and preaching, gossip and slander. Certainly there were strands in public discourse that reminded Commons of their low social status and urged them to keep quiet and do their work, but there was plenty in the common voice to license action at least when the world was out of joint and other holders of representative authority had failed. So here then we are reaching the other side of the question. What provoked Commons action? It seems to me that there were normally three preconditions, and they somewhat overlap. One is a generalised sense of injustice, a sense that the bounds of what was customary or reasonable or lawful had been transgressed. This doesn't mean that risings of the Commons were inherently conservative, though they often did react against governmental novelties, such as changes in the tax system, or in 1536 and in the Western Rising of 1549, changes in religion. In fact, the Commons' ideas of justice could also contradict established social practice, as in 1381, when the rebels seem to have sought the end of serfdom and perhaps of all lordship, bar the king's, as well as the establishment of rents of 4d an acre and the removal of all the bishops. But in that case, it seems to me, the Commons were appealing to the principles of law and representation that the royal government proclaimed, even if these were not upheld. Justice was supposed to be free to all free men and equal between all free men, regardless of social standing. There's no lords in the common law of England. The king's laws were supposed to apply equally to all. Taxes were supposed to rest on consent and to be granted in return for the defence of the realm and the redress of grievances. These conventions were very widely known. Cade's rebels in 1450 pointed out that the king could not simply live upon his commons. The contrary is true, for then needed him never to set parliament and to ask good of them. So often the Commons wanted the government to practice what it preached, and then to hear their proposals on other matters, just as it heard those of the merchants and gentry in Parliament. So a sense of injustice doesn't mean conservatism then, but it was one precondition for revolt. The others, linked together, were a sense that the elite was divided and that some of its members were likely to sympathise with popular complaint. All the major risings of the Commons coincided with periods of governmental disarray. The king was a child, like Richard II or Edward VI, so those who ruled in his name lacked legitimacy. There was a danger of foreign invasion, as in 1381, 1450, probably in 1489, 1497 and 1536, and there was no sign that the government was ready or able to resist. There were angry parliaments denouncing the men around the king, as in 1376 or 1449 to 50. The regime appeared shaky, as in the uneasy times of Henry VII, or in the wake of the fall of Anne Boleyn in 1536. And there were those in high places who might support the Commons' desires. The child king himself in 1381, the Duke of York in 1450, the so-called Aragonese faction in 1536, and so on. So with the usual authorities failing, and the danger that evil counsellors around the king might join forces with foreign enemies or selfish upstarts within the kingdom, the Commons had a certain obligation to act. Or, if we look at it in more pragmatic terms, illegitimate regimes like the ones that were in power prior to all these rebellions were less likely to be able to maintain order and defend the realm, and more likely to pursue uncustomary policies, novel taxes and other expedients, in order to gain the means to exercise authority. They were thus much more likely to stir up criticisms and tensions which they couldn't contain, and so they were more likely to create the kind of atmosphere in which large-scale uprising became a practicable course of action. So there is a certain correlation here, then, between the ideology and the real practice of the Commons. Problems had to be plausibly connective and sufficiently extreme to permit and enable the assembly of large groups of people. The Commons would and could only rise when the commonweal was believably and widely endangered. Often, of course, this danger was felt regionally rather than nationally. Commons revolts had to begin somewhere, though they typically spread quickly and widely through letters, through messengers and rumours, and they generally affected a national importance by occupying regional capitals like Exeter or Norwich or York, or by marching towards London to confront the king. Local grievances soon came to be seen as specific expressions of problems that affected the whole realm, and as the scope of each rising developed, they were typically subsumed into more global protests, indeed protests that reflected the concerns of a wide social range of participants. As we've seen, risings of the commons were typically cross-class coalitions, and under the guise of a common voice, they advanced a range of demands, some of which were contradictory. Among the most vociferous participants in the Peasants' Revolt, for instance, were reeves, the men who were charged with extracting labour services from recalcitrant villeins, and yeomen, the very group of employers who most needed the hated labour laws, which the whole movement was in many ways against. On the face of it, these were unlikely participants then in a revolt against serfdom. And yet the chance or the need to join in the ventilation of common anger, to petition the king and demand redress of the ills of the realm, was simply too big to ignore. So revolts of the commons had to represent common opinion, and the common voice might be the lowest common denominator. So by now I have strayed into my third question, which is just as well because time is pressing. What kinds of action did the commons engage in, and where did their actions lead? It will be clear by now that the commons were associated with three activities above all. First of all, showing or demonstrating or testifying to wrongs, and by association seeking their redress. Second, defending the realm and the king, in particular protecting him from those who were enemies of the common weal and therefore enemies of himself, even if he mistakenly regarded them as his friends. And third, doing justice in the name of the king and of the commons. Now once again, I have presented the commons in the legitimising terms that they characteristically presented themselves. They call us risers, protested Cade's rebels, but by our writings you may conceive if we be the king's friends or his enemies. But these pretensions were not meaningless. It was only by adopting these postures that popular leaders were able to generalise their grievances. And as I suggested, they could only do that. They could only take oaths, form armed bands and produce manifestos when their grievances were reasonably general. Movements of the commons typically went to some lengths to behave responsibly, to prevent looting and indiscriminate violence, to maintain the forms of judicial process against their victims, to make arrangements for the defence of their homelands when they set off for London, and to defer to royal authority if the king would meet with them, often accepting pardons once they had presented their petitions. Now, of course, that was a prudential compromise, but it fits perfectly with the rationale of these manoeuvres. Inevitably, things could get rather messier in practice. People were lynched and robbed, property was destroyed, fighting broke out. But of course, most medieval politics involved a measure of violence, and for all the alarm that was expressed by clerical and bourgeois chroniclers, the depredations of popular revolts were a lot more modest than those of royal armies. Did revolts of the commons achieve anything? Well, the answer of historians tends to be no, and it's certainly the case that rebel hosts were defeated or dispersed, that ringleaders were tracked down, and whole areas of the country subjected to punitive judicial raids in the aftermath of each rebellion. And yet, the expression of public anger was not without results. After every great revolt, government policy changed tack. There were no more poll taxes after 1381. Indeed, there was much less taxation of any kind for a while, and there was a rapid end to serfdom, albeit not just because of the Peasants' Revolt. The MPs of the 1380s pressed for reforms of precisely the kind that had been proposed in 1376 in the Good Parliament and in a cruder form in the Revolt of 1381. And the MPs of the Wars of the Roses did exactly the same with the proposals of Cade's rebels in 1450. Indeed, Fortescue's Governance of England, the blueprint of Tudor monarchy, contains much the same programme that York, Cade and the MPs of 1449 to 50 had called for. Henry VII pulled out of foreign war soon after the revolt of 1489, and Henry VIII did the same after the amicable Grant Rising of 1525, or at least he did until the 1540s when he had a huge slush fund of monastic land to fund his activities in France. And if the Pilgrimage of Grace didn't stop the dissolution of the monasteries, it probably did help to stop the government's experiments in property law and doctrinal change. The conservative turn in Henrician theology after 1536 may well have been a tacit response to the Commons' demonstrations. And more generally, it seems to me, later medieval governments were sensitive to what I've called the pressure of the public. Their instincts were often repressive, but they were also responsive, and responsive to a wider group than the cronies of the ancien regime. The knowledge that the Commons might rise, and the recognition that their risings possessed a certain legitimacy, acted as a brake on government policy. And we can see that in the general withdrawal from the expensive war in France and the concomitant reduction in taxation across the 15th century. Henry VIII's government, it's true, behaved more provocatively, but that was partly in response to other imperatives, notably those of dynastic security, on which the King and the Commons took different views. By and large, regimes were mindful of common opinion, conscious of where it could lead, and aware that other leading politicians, prelates, magnates, MPs, were also alert to what the Commons were thinking and saying, and might break ranks if the common clamour rose too high. Now, in the course of the 16th century, the age of Commons revolts came to an end. It would be tempting to try to explain why, but that's something that others present can probably deal with more expertly than I can, and I'm going to take a different cue from the fact that the 1549 risings were really the last of their kind and bring my paper to a close. How should we understand the activity of the Commons in later medieval England? What does it tell us about the Middle Ages, about English history, and about the present? Well, I subtitled my paper Between Subjects and Citizens, and I hope I've shown how the Commons were located in that delicate position. Like citizens, they assumed a right to participate in the politics of their community, to guide its leaders, and to shape its ends, though their aim was generally to restore it to the paths set down by established principles, including those like equality of justice, that were honoured more in the breach than in the performance. But like subjects, on the other hand, they confined themselves mainly to showing wrongs and inviting the authorities to act, though their invitations could be pretty forceful, and when they managed to get to the heart of things, as they did in 1381 and 1450, their leaders might take kingly power upon themselves. Considered as representative institutions, assemblies of the Commons were both strong and weak. They were strong in their legitimations and in their practical capacity to compel participation and erode the hierarchies on which authority normally depended. The evaporation of Henry VI's army in the face of Cade's rebellion is one of the more striking reminders of the fragility of elite power in this period. But they were weak too in their inability to act for any coherent group. They were too broad and unwieldy to advance any class interest, that of workers, for instance, or smallholders, or even employers. They were stuck with promoting what was common, and although that could enable them to rein in the activities of the state, whose overweening power did affect all Englishmen and women, one way or another, they couldn't do much more than that. It seems to me that that says something quite profound about English history. Ours is a much governed country, and so it has been for centuries. While that very fact has produced a profound tradition, a fine tradition of dissent and resistance, it has also steered that tradition towards forms of compliance, towards the modification and redirection of the eternal strong state, rather than its rejection or its fragmentation, or indeed towards federalisation. Just as Magna Carta embraced so many features of Angevin kingship, so the Commons, in their loyal opposition to the enemies of king and realm, affirmed the political community of which they were a part, allowing the Crown to maintain its remarkably monistic sway over their fortunes. The Whig tradition in English historiography, which emphasised continuity, peacefulness, and prudent adjustment of the governing order to include an ever larger proportion of the population, the Whig tradition focused its attention on Parliament, on the common law, and the widening franchise. But it might reasonably have included revolts of the Commons. They fit the same story. And yet, who cannot be stirred by these Wat Tylers and Jack Cades? Who cannot be impressed by a Middle Ages in which, unlike today, subjects might band together over something more important than the final of Strictly Come Dancing? Who has not thought that a Jack Straw, and I don't mean the inappropriately named former Foreign Secretary, who has not thought that a Jack Straw and his cohorts might have been a bit more use in the wake of the great banking scandal than the feeble Occupy movement? Of course, it is true that the Commons, who might have done for the financial sector what it couldn't do for itself and what the government wouldn't do on our behalf, are probably the same Commons who made death threats to the Director General of the BBC when he axed Jeremy Clarkson from Top Gear. And of course, it's also worth remembering which prominent UK politician plays most notably with the idea of the Commons today. "I'm a commoner," he said in February of this year, "and like common people, I shall be heading off to the pub." In fact, one of his staff has revealed he then headed to a local coffee shop for a cappuccino. Not exactly Vox Populi, Vox Dei, but we are where we are. Thank you.